Why was the Medici family important to Renaissance art?
The Medici family was powerful in Florence, Italy, between the 14th and 16th centuries. The founder of the family was Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici, 1360–1429. Who amassed a large fortune through his skill in trade and who virtually ruled Florence between 1421 and 1429. Later, Lorenzo de' Medici, 1449–1492, ruled Florence between 1478 and 1492. Though he was tyrannical, he was a great patron of the arts and letters. Lorenzo, also called the Magnificent, maintained Fiesole, a villa outside Florence, where he surrounded himself with the great talents and thinkers of Florence, including a young artist named Sandro Botticelli, 1445–1510. Lorenzo was also a patron of Michelangelo.
What were pieces of 8?
Pieces of 8 were Spanish silver coins, pesos, that circulated along with other hard currency in the American colonies. Since the settlements in the New World were all possessions of their mother countries, England, Spain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, they did not have monetary systems of their own. England forbade its American colonies to issue money. Colonists used whatever foreign currency they could get their hands on. Pieces of 8, from Spain, reals, from Spain and Portugal, and shillings, from England, were in circulation. The pieces of 8 were most common. The Spanish silver coin was so named because it was worth 8 reals and at one time had an 8 stamped on it. To make change, the coin was cut up to resemble pieces of a pie. 2 pieces, or 2 bits, of the silver coin made up a quarter, which is why Americans still refer to a quarter of a dollar as 2 bits. There were frequent money shortages in the colonies, which usually ran a trade deficit with Europe. The colonies supplied raw goods to Europe, but finished goods, including manufactured items, were mostly imported, resulting in an imbalance of trade. With coinage scarce, most colonists conducted trade as barter, exchanging goods and services for the same. In 1652, Massachusetts became the first colony to mint its own coins. That year there was no monarch on the throne of England. Although the issue of coinage by colonists was strictly prohibited by England, the Puritans of Massachusetts continued to make their own coins for some 30 years thereafter, stamping the year 1652 on them as a way to circumvent the law.
Since the beauty of the manuscript, what was the first American newspaper?
America's first regular newspaper was the Weekly Newsletter, published by Boston postmaster John Campbell, 1653 to 1728. It was published for nearly 2 decades, between 1704 and 1722, and consisted of a single 7 by 11-inch sheet of paper covered on both sides with news. Not all of it substantiated, from post riders, sea captains, and sailors. By 1765 there were more than 20 newspapers in the American colonies. Was meant to represent the spiritual beauty of the text, usually Gospels. Psalms, prayers, or meditations, sacred books became increasingly ornamental. Some books of hours, devotional books developed during the 1300s, are considered masterpieces of illumination. The works, c. 1409-16, of Belgian illuminators Paul Herman and Johanniken Limburg represent the height of painted religious manuscripts.
Who was Carrie Nation?
The Kentucky-born Carrie Nation, 1846 to 1911, became famous as a temperance agitator in the early 1900s. The saloon was illegal in her resident state of Kansas, and she felt it was her divine duty to take her hatchet to ruining any place that sold intoxicants. Between 1899 and 1909, she went on wrecking expeditions, which she called hatchetations, throughout the state, incurring the wrath of business owners and government officials. Though many might have favored national prohibition of alcohol, Nation's actions were extreme to say the least, causing her to be arrested, imprisoned 30 times, and even shot at. She persisted, however, buoyed by the belief that she was performing a public and even divine service. The propitiously named Carrie A. Nation, who tried, it seems, to carry the nation straight to the water fountain, did not live to see prohibition made into a national policy in 1917 nor to see it revoked in 1933.
How frequently have tsunamis occurred throughout the world?
Tsunamis typically occur about every 6 years in the Pacific Ocean, and most often during March, August, and November. Although sometimes called tidal waves, tsunamis are created not by tides but by seismic movements. Earthquakes, which produce chains of waves that move across the water at terrific speeds of more than 500 miles per hour. Upon reaching shallow water, the waves grow in height, sometimes to 100 feet or more, as was the case in 1883 when tsunamis reaching up to 130 feet hit an Indonesian island, destroying more than 150 villages and claiming some 36,000 lives. In ancient times, it is believed that a tsunami destroyed the Minoan Greek culture, that of a people who lived on the island of Crete, in the Mediterranean Sea. In about 1450 BC, Crete was struck by a 200-foot tsunami, which either demolished the island or weakened the population such that they could be taken over by the Mycenaeans, who were Greek mainlanders. while tsunamis are known to strike along the Pacific Rim. Damage has been minimized by sophisticated instruments that help meteorologists monitor and predict disastrous weather, alerting the public to evacuate from areas of possible danger. Such systems did not exist for the Indian Ocean when a 9.0 earthquake off the coast of the Indonesian island of Sumatra struck on December 26, 2004.
Who was Rosie the Riveter?
The term referred to the American women who worked factory jobs as part of the war effort on the home front, where auto plants and other industrial facilities were converted into defense plants to manufacture airplanes, ships, and weapons. As World War II, 1939–45, wore on, more and more men went overseas to fight, resulting in a shortage of civilian male workers. And so, women pitched in. However, at the end of the war, many of these women were displaced as the men returned home to their jobs and civilian life. Nevertheless, the contribution of all the Rosie the Riveters was instrumental to the war effort.
Who invented the hot air balloon?
French papermakers Joseph Michel, 1740–1810, and Jacques Etienne, 1745–1799. Montgolfier built the first practical balloon filled with hot air. On June 5, 1783, the Montgolfiers launched a large balloon at a public gathering in Annonay, France. It ascended for 10 minutes. 3 months later, they sent a duck, a sheep, and a rooster up in a balloon, and the animals were landed safely. This success prompted the Montgolfiers to attempt to launch a balloon carrying a human. In October 1783, French scientist Jean-François Pilatre de Rozier, 1756–1785, became the first person to make a balloon ascent, but the balloon was held captive, for safety. The following month he became one of 2 men to make the first free flight in a hot air balloon, which ascended to a height of about 300 feet over Paris on November 21, 1783. And drifted over the city for about 25 minutes. Hot air ballooning, which proved to be better than the rival hydrogen-filled balloon developed in France at about the same time, became very popular in Europe. In January 1785, hot air balloonists successfully crossed the English Channel from Dover, England, to Calais, France. Across the Atlantic, hot air balloons made their debut in the United States in Philadelphia in 1793 before a crowd that included George Washington, 1732–1799, who was then President of the United States.
Who was Florence Nightingale?
The English nurse, hospital reformer, and philanthropist is considered the founder of modern nursing. The daughter of well-to-do British parents, Florence Nightingale, 1820 to 1910, was born in Florence, Italy. Though she was raised in privilege on her family's estate in England, Nightingale had a natural and irrepressible inclination toward caring for others. Despite her parents' wishes, Nightingale, who, in accordance with the social standards of her set and day, had already been presented to the Queen, entered a training program for nurses near Dusseldorf, Germany. She went on to study in Paris. In 1853 Nightingale became superintendent of a hospital for invalid women in London. In 1854 Nightingale took 38 nurses with her to the city of Üsküdar, near Istanbul, Turkey. There, despite great obstacles, she set up a barrack hospital to treat soldiers who were injured in the Crimean War. 1853–56, then being fought between Russian forces and the Allied armies of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, and Sardinia, part of present-day Italy. Nightingale set about cleaning the filthy hospital facility, established strict schedules for the staff, and introduced sanitation methods that reduced the spread of infectious diseases such as cholera, typhus, and dysentery. While her methods were considered controversial at first, doctors initially found Nightingale to be demanding and pushy. They got results. Before long, Nightingale was put in charge of all the Allied army hospitals in the Crimea. During the fighting, Nightingale visited the front and caught Crimean fever, which threatened her life. By this time she had become so well known that Queen Victoria, 1819–1901, was aware of and deeply concerned about Nightingale's illness. By the end of the war, Nightingale's care of the sick and wounded was legendary. Known for walking the floor of the hospital at night, tending her patients, she became known as the Lady with the Lamp. After the war, Nightingale returned to London, and in 1860, with £50,000 sterling, she established a training institution for nurses in London. In 1873, Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and New Haven Hospital in Connecticut opened the United States' first nursing schools. All of them were patterned after the London program founded by Nightingale. Nightingale's fierce determination, which ran contrary to her parents' wishes for her as well as to the social standard of the day, made her a legend. And rightly so, because of her concern for the sick, the standard of care of all patients improved.
What were the Freedom Rides?
The Freedom Rides were a series of bus rides designed to test the U.S. Supreme Court's prohibition of segregation in interstate travel. In 1960, in the case of Boynton v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a Howard University student who charged that segregation laws at the Richmond, Virginia, bus station violated federal anti-segregation laws. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided to test the enforcement of the federal law by initiating the Freedom Rides. On May 4, 1961, 13 people, black and white, boarded a bus for the South. Meant as a nonviolent means of protest against local segregation laws. The riders were nevertheless met with violence, when the bus reached Montgomery, Alabama. On May 20, a white mob was waiting, the Freedom Riders were beaten. Rioting broke out in the city, and U.S. Marshals were sent to restore order. The interracial campaign to desegregate transportation was ultimately successful. But government intervention was required to enforce the laws. As numerous Southern whites had demonstrated that they weren't going to comply voluntarily.
How are amendments made to the U.S. Constitution?
There are two paths that proposed amendments can take to become law. The first path is this: an amendment is proposed in Congress, 2/3 of both houses must then approve it. If they do not, then the proposal ends here, if approved in both houses of the U.S. Congress. The proposed amendment is sent to the legislatures, or conventions, of each state of the Union. 3/4 of all the state legislatures must then approve it. By whatever rules each state legislature uses, once 3/4 of the states approve it, the amendment is made. If 3/4 of the states do not approve it, the amendment fails to become law. The second path is this: the legislatures of 2/3 of the states ask for an amendment to be made to the U.S. Constitution. Congress then calls a convention to propose it. Then the proposed amendment becomes a law when it is ratified by the legislatures in 3/4 of the states. While this path has never been taken, it's an important provision nonetheless, since it allows for a popular, state-based proposal to be considered.
What is the Mycenaean age?
The Dorians, aided by the superiority of the iron sword, flooded southward, where they sacked and burned the great Mycenaean cities and conquered the wealthy sea traders, throwing Greece into the period known as the Dark Ages, or Archaic period, which lasted from 1100 to about 800 B.C.
How old is the British Parliament?
The Legislative Assembly of Great Britain has roots dating back to the Middle Ages. 500-1350, when a great council, known as the Curia Regis, advised the king. This body was made up of nobility and clergy. The body evolved over time and progressively gained more power to govern. Today Parliament consists of the House of Commons, a democratically elected body, roughly equivalent to the U.S. House of Representatives, the House of Lords. which consists of noblemen, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, as well as high-ranking Anglican clergy, bishops and abbots, and the monarch, king or queen. Since 1911 the power of the House of Lords has been negligible, with the House of Commons charged with electing the Prime Minister, who must be a member of Commons. The Prime Minister, not the monarch, is the executive head of government.
What is existentialism?
Existentialism is not a single school of thought but rather a label applied to several systems that are influenced by the theories of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, 1813–1855. Existentialist thinkers consider one problem: human existence in an unfathomable universe. However, in considering this plight, philosophers have arrived at different conclusions. The founder of existentialism, Kierkegaard, rejected the principles put forth by traditional philosophers such as George Hegel, 1770–1831, who had considered philosophy as a science, asserting that it is both objective and certain. Kierkegaard overturned this assertion, citing that truth is not objective but rather subjective, that there is no such thing as universal truths, and that human existence is not understandable in scientific terms. He maintained that human beings must make their own choices, based on their own knowledge. When he wrote on the subject, Kierkegaard frequently used pseudonyms, a practice he defended by intimating that he was putting the onus on his readers to determine what is true, that they shouldn't rely on the authority of his philosophies. In the 20th century, heirs to Kierkegaard's school of thought included German philosopher Martin Heidegger, 1889–1976, who rejected the label existentialist, and the French writer Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905–1980, the only self-proclaimed existentialist. They grappled with the dilemma that human beings must use their free will to make decisions and assume responsibility for those decisions without knowing conclusively what is true or false, right or wrong, good or bad. In other words, there is no way of knowing absolutely what the correct choices are. And yet individuals must make choices all the time, and be held accountable for them. Sartre described this as a terrifying freedom. However, theologians such as American Paul Tillich, 1886–1965, reconsidered the human condition in light of Christianity, arriving at far less pessimistic conclusions than did Sartre. For example, Tillich asserted that divine answers exist. Similarly, Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, 1878–1965, who was also influenced by Kierkegaard, proposed that a personal and direct dialogue between the individual and God yields truths
What was the 7 Years' War?
It was a worldwide conflict that began in 1756 between Prussia and Austria, who fought over control of Germany and over who would be the supreme power in Europe. Great Britain threw its support behind King Frederick II, the Great, 1712 to 1786, of Prussia. But by the following year Austria was supported not only by France, but also by Sweden, most of the German states, and, very importantly, Russia. Spain joined the fighting on the side of Austria also, but it was not until late in the game after 1762. With such alliances forged among the European states, the conflict soon spilled over, manifesting itself in the colonies of North America and India, where the French and British fought each other for control. In order to assert his authority in Europe, Prussia's King Frederick had launched many military initiatives and was in a weakened state by the time his army faced the Austrians in 1756. He was spared certain defeat only by an event in Russia in 1762, upon the death of Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna. 1709 to 1762, who had feared King Frederick, Peter III, 1728 to 1762, ascended the Russian throne. Peter, unlike his predecessor, held Frederick in high esteem, and he proceeded to withdraw Russia's support from Austria and reach a peace agreement with Austria's enemy, Prussia. He died that same year. The 7 Years' War ended the next year. On February 15, 1763, with the signing of a peace agreement in Saxony, Germany. The area that Austria had fought to control remained, for the most part, under Prussian rule, positioning Prussia as a leading European power. There were no other territorial changes in Europe as a result of the war. In North America and India, Britain emerged from the conflicts as the victor and as the colonial power.
What were Pasteur's discoveries on disease?
Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, may be best known for developing the process that bears his name, pasteurization, but the French chemist and microbiologist made other important contributions to public health, including the discovery of vaccines to prevent diseases in animals and the establishment of a Paris Institute for the study of deadly and contagious diseases. In the 1860s, the hard-working Pasteur was asked to investigate problems that French winemakers were having with the fermentation process. Spoilage of wine and beer during fermentation was resulting in serious economic losses for France. Observing wine under a microscope, Pasteur noticed that spoiled wine had a proliferation of bacterial cells that produce lactic acid. The chemist suggested gently heating the wine to destroy the harmful bacteria, and then allowing the wine to age naturally. Pasteur published his findings and his recommendations in book form in 1866. The idea of heating edible substances to destroy disease-causing organisms was later applied to other perishable fluids, chief among them milk. Pasteur later studied animal diseases, developing a vaccination to prevent anthrax in sheep and cattle. The deadly animal disease is spread from animals to humans through contact or the inhalation of spores. In 1876, German physician Robert Koch, 1843–1910, had identified the bacteria that causes anthrax. And Pasteur weakened this microbe in his laboratory before injecting it into animals, which then developed an immunity to the disease. He also showed that vaccination could be used to prevent chicken cholera. In 1881, Pasteur began studying rabies, an agonizing and deadly disease spread by the bite of infected animals. Along with his assistant, Pierre-Paul Émile Roux, 1853–1933. Pasteur spent long hours in the laboratory, and the determination paid off. Pasteur developed a vaccine that prevented the development of rabies in test animals. On July 6, 1885, the scientists were called on to administer the vaccine to a small boy who was bitten by a rabid dog. Pasteur hesitated to provide the treatment, but as the boy faced certain and painful death from rabies, Pasteur proceeded. Following several weeks of painful injections to the stomach, the boy did not get rabies. Pasteur's treatment was a success. The curative and preventive treatments for rabies, also called hydrophobia, we know today are based on Pasteur's vaccination, which has allowed officials to control the spread of the disease. In 1888, the Institut Pasteur was established in Paris to provide a teaching and research center on contagious diseases. Pasteur was director of the institute until his death in 1895.
When did European colonialism begin?
Seeking out colonies for economic benefit dates back to ancient times. Even the Romans ruled colonies in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But colonialism took hold during the Renaissance, between 1400 and 1600. When powerful European countries sent explorers to find new lands and forge new trade routes. Portugal and Spain sought sea routes to India and the Far East. In the process, the Portuguese gained control of what is now Brazil. They also established trading posts in West Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Spain gained control of most of Latin America and vast regions of what is now the United States. However, the Dutch, English, and French also had influence in these areas. And of course, the English eventually established 13 colonies in North America. The English also became a strong influence in India and Africa, while the Dutch gained control of the Indonesian islands, which became the Dutch East Indies. The results of colonialism were many. While trade was expanded and there was an enormous exchange of raw goods, the colonies were also rife with conflict. Indigenous peoples were killed or forcibly displaced from their lands, and foreign powers fought with each other for control of the same areas. The British and French fought 4 wars in North America between 1689 and 1763 alone. Further, Europeans brought to these new lands their own languages, religions, and systems of government, imposing their culture, beliefs, and ideologies on native peoples.
When was email invented?
Short for electronic mail, email was invented in 1971 by computer engineer Ray Tomlinson, 1941, who developed a communications program for computer users at the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The result was ARPANET, a program that allowed text messages to be sent to any other computer on the local network. ARPANET is now hailed as the Model T of the information superhighway. The technology expanded in the 1970s with the use of modems, which connect computers via telephone lines. Within a decade of its introduction, email had become widely used as a communications mode in the workplace. In the 1990s, usage expanded rapidly to Internet users at home, schools, and elsewhere. Some technology analysts call email the killer app of the Internet, the most powerful tool on the worldwide computer network.
What was the world like between the world wars?
Before World War II began in 1939, World War I, 1914-18, was referred to as the Great War. And understandably so, given its enormous impact. The price of the conflict was paid in human casualties. More than 10 million soldiers died and another 20 million were wounded. Civilian deaths were equally devastating, resulting from widespread hunger and flu epidemics. This was in the days preceding the advent of penicillin to treat complications from influenza. During the 1920s, with the death toll of the Great War a recent memory, the civilized world enjoyed a period of relative peace. In the United States, the decade was known as the Roaring Twenties, 10 years of prosperity and even frivolity. Despite ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1919, which prohibited the sale and consumption of intoxicating liquors. At the close of the Great War, the League of Nations had been established to handle disputes among countries and avoid another major conflict. This was followed in 1928 by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, also called the Pact of Paris, in which 15 nations agreed to settle conflicts by diplomacy rather than military might. Eventually 62 nations ratified the agreement. Meanwhile, in Germany an extreme sense of nationalism was taking hold. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the Great War, seriously weakened the nation, allowing the rise of the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. Nazis were determined to see their beloved homeland rise to power once again. And they found a ready following among the German people. In 1929 a general downturn began in the world economy. triggered by the U.S. stock market crash of late October. As the United States fell into the severe and sustained economic crisis known as the Great Depression. Other industrialized nations including Germany also felt the impact. Unemployment jumped to record levels in many countries. And a lack of social welfare programs resulted in the destitution of numerous families. Politicians and economists alike searched for solutions to the crisis. Many turning to anti-free trade or isolationist policies to protect their own. Meanwhile, post-war efforts to keep peace were proving ineffective. Japan invaded Manchuria, China. In 1931, Italy conquered Ethiopia. In 1936, civil war raged in Spain, 1936–39. India became the site of a bitter struggle between British rulers and Indian nationalists, and the Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and would be absorbed by the outbreak of World War II, was fought in Asia. A dangerous alliance was forged when Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the Axis powers in 1936. Also, by 1933, Germany had become a totalitarian state known as the Third Reich. In 1938, Nazi armies took their first steps toward gaining supremacy when they marched into Austria and claimed it, setting the stage for World War II, 1939–45.
What happened to Challenger?
On January 28, 1986, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, launched the 25th mission of its Space Shuttle program. The Challenger carried a crew of 7, including Krista McAuliffe. 1948–1986, who was to be the first schoolteacher in space. She was slated to broadcast a series of lessons to school children throughout America. The crew's commander was Francis Scobie, 1939–1986, who had piloted a 1984 shuttle mission. The pilot was Michael Smith, 1945–1986, who was making his first flight in space. Mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, 1946–1986, Ronald McNair, 1950–1986, and Judith Resnick, 1949–1986, were all experienced space travelers. And payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, 1944–1986, was making his first space flight. That cold and clear January morning, the Challenger's takeoff was delayed by 2 hours. Freezing temperatures overnight had produced ice on the shuttle and launch pad, which prompted NASA to conduct inspections to assess the condition of the craft. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger was launched into space. Just 73 seconds later and at an altitude of 48,000 feet, the craft still in view of the spectators on the ground, Challenger burst into flames. While NASA controllers were aware of what had happened, they had, among other things, heard Smith utter, "Uh-oh," just 1 second prior to the explosion. It took a moment for the spectators to understand. But as the fireball grew bigger and debris scattered, The spectators, including family and friends of the crew, fell silent. The crew, inside a module that detached from the shuttle during the blow-up, evidently survived the explosion but died upon impact after a 9-mile free fall into the Atlantic Ocean. 6 weeks after the disaster, the crew module was recovered from the ocean floor. All 7 astronauts were buried with full honors. Investigations into the crash revealed that the O-rings, seals, on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters had failed to work, due to the low temperatures. The O-rings had stiffened and thereby lost their ability to act as a seal. A government commission recommended a complete redesign of the solid rocket booster joints. A review of the astronaut escape systems, to work toward achieving greater safety margins. Regulation of the rate of shuttle flights to maximize safety. And a sweeping reform of the shuttle program's management structure. The space agency retrenched. It was almost 3 years later, on September 29, 1988, before another American shuttle flew in space.
How were Europe's lines redrawn as a result of World War I?
The treaties that came out of the Paris Peace Conference. 1919-20, redrew Europe's boundaries, carving new nations out of the defeated powers. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to give up territory to Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, France, and Poland. Germany also forfeited all of its overseas colonies and turned over coal fields to France for the next 15 years. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon toppled the former Empire of Austria-Hungary, whose Archduke had been assassinated in 1914, triggering the war. So that the separate nations of Austria and Hungary were formed, each occupying less than a third of their former area. Their former territory was divided among Italy, Romania, and the countries newly recognized by the treaties: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the kingdom that later became Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Sèvres took Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, Palestine, and Syria away from the Ottoman Empire, which 3 years later became the Republic of Turkey. Finally, Bulgaria lost territory to Greece and Romania. However, these new borders would serve to heighten tensions between some countries, as the territorial claims of the newly redrawn nations overlapped with each other.
Why is Mecca a holy city for Muslims?
Mecca, in western Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570, and was his home until the year 622, when those who opposed him forced him to flee to Medina, a city about 200 miles north of Mecca. Muhammad later returned to Mecca and died there in 632. Mecca is also the site of the Great Mosque, which is situated in the heart of the city. The outside of the mosque is an arcade, made up of a series of arches enclosing a courtyard. In that courtyard is the most sacred shrine of Islam, the Kaaba, or Kaaba. A small stone building that contains the black stone, which Muslims believe was sent from heaven by Allah, God. When Muslims pray, 5 times a day, according to the 5 pillars of faith, they face the Kaaba. It is also the destination of the Hajj, or pilgrimage.
What were bonanza farms?
Bonanza farms were extremely successful and large farms, principally on the Great Plains and in the West, that emerged during the second half of the 1800s. The word bonanza, which is derived from Spanish and means literally good weather, was coined in the mid-1800s. It is used to refer to any source of great and sudden wealth, including mines rich in minerals. Large-scale farming had been aided by the development of machinery that greatly increased production, especially of wheat and other grains. The innovations included reapers invented by Cyrus Hall McCormick, 1809 to 1884, and steel plows developed by John Deere, 1804 to 1886. Several events further helped farming interests west of the Mississippi River. To promote westward settlement, Congress passed the Homestead Act, 1862, which allowed for ready and cheap acquisition of vast tracts of land. Settlers could buy land for as little as $1.25 per acre, or they could live on a tract and farm it for a period of 5 years, at the end of which they were granted 160 acres. The U.S. Army's defeats of rebel Indians were followed by peace treaties that confined Indian agricultural activities to reservations. In 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad arrived at Fargo, North Dakota, allowing farmers to ship their products greater distances. Finally, dry farming techniques, which allow fields to lie fallow every other year in order to regain their nutrients and moisture to support crops the following year, proved to be a successful method for growing in the Great Plains, previously thought to be too dry for cultivating crops. All of these factors combined to turn some western farms into bonanza sources of great wealth for their owners. Encouraged by their success, settlers poured into the West. But not all farmers fared as well, and many were severely hit by the Panic of 1873, a drought in the plains. States in the 1880s caused farm prices to drop, further hurting Western farmers.
What does the UN do?
Representatives of member countries work to keep peace and ensure security for people around the globe. Over the decades, the UN has expanded its role as a provider of humanitarian aid and stepped up its efforts in the area of human rights. When disputes arise, the UN works toward diplomatic resolution. Though not always successful in its role as peacekeeper or peace negotiator. The organization has provided a forum for debate, which has prevented some disputes from developing into major wars. And through its various agencies, the UN provides assistance to developing nations, promotes humanitarian causes, and sends relief to war-torn areas. However, critics have charged the international organization with arbitrarily defining borders between countries, saying that these drawn boundaries divide ethnic groups and result in conflicts, such as in the Middle East and Africa.
Is there a golden age of television?
Yes, people commonly refer to the 1950s as TV's golden age, which is the decade when Americans embraced television and the networks responded with a rapid expansion of programming. Critics still hail the programs of the golden age to be the most innovative programming in television history. It was during this decade that anthology programs such as Kraft Television Theater, Playhouse 90, and Studio One made live drama part of the nightly fare on primetime television. Americans could tune in to watch original screenplays such as 12 Angry Men, 1954, Visit to a Small Planet, 1955, and The Miracle Worker, 1957. And tune in they did, prompting the production of more than 30 anthology programs sponsored by the likes of Goodyear, Philco, U.S. Steel, Breck, and Schlitz, since the production work was based in New York. The anthologies drew young playwrights including Gore Vidal, Rod Serling, Arthur Miller, and A.E. Hotchner. A new group of prominent television directors and producers emerged, and the studio dramas attracted the talents of actors George C. Scott, James Dean, Paul Newman, Grace Kelly, Eva Marie Saint, Sidney Poitier, Lee Remick, and Jack Lemmon. The other cornerstone of 1950 television programming was the variety show Also Done Live. Comedians Jack Benny, Red Skelton, Jackie Gleason, George Burns, Sid Caesar, and M.R. Television Milton Burley thrived in the format. But the cost of producing live programs and the growing popularity of television, which created a new mass market that demanded even more programming, combined to spell the end of television's golden age. Soon, live dramas and variety shows were replaced by situation comedies, westerns, and other set-staged programs that could be taped in advance, and could be produced in quantity.
What was the 1990s boom?
It was the longest economic expansion in American history. According to accepted economic indicators, the boom began in March 1991, when the first President Bush was in office, and ended in March 2001, when President George W. Bush was in office. 8 years of the expansion were during the Clinton administration. The hallmarks of the 1990s boom were the creation of almost 24 million jobs, or an average of 200,000 jobs a month, a national unemployment rate that dropped to around 4% for an extended period. Productivity gains month over month, gross domestic product, GDP, growth month over month. Unprecedented investment in the stock market, Wall Street added $10 trillion in wealth over the decade. A bull market fueled by $100 billion in initial public offerings, IPOs, many of them technology stocks. Low interest rates, a low inflation rate averaging 2.6% per year, the elimination of the federal budget deficit, and the addition of dollars to the paychecks of many American workers. The last time the economy had seen similar indicators was during the 1960s. But in January 2000 the boom surpassed all others to become the longest sustained expansion in U.S. history. Economists considered the factors that contributed to the boom. A Christian Science Monitor writer credited a combination of ubiquitous American entrepreneurial spirit, massive amounts of technology, and a man named Greenspan. But Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which controls interest rates, credited information technology as the defining factor of this special period. Its major contribution is to reduce the number of worker hours required to produce the nation's output, said Greenspan. The boom ended in March 2001, along with the end of the dot-com bubble. The nation began a short recession, which ended November 2001, according to economic indicators. The economy then began a slow, and by most indicators, weak recovery.
How did the novel develop?
Critics and scholars agree that it is French writer Gustave Flaubert, 1821 to 1880, who developed the modern novel into a conscious art form. Flaubert's Madame Bovary is recognized for its objective characterization, irony, narrative technique, and use of imagery and symbolism. American writer, and naturalized British citizen, Henry James, 1843 to 1916, is acknowledged for having enlarged the scope of the novel, introducing dramatic elements to the narrative, developing point of view technique, and advocating realism in literature. James's works include The American, 1877, Daisy Miller, 1879. The Portrait of a Lady, 1881, and The Ambassadors, 1903. Irish writer James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, considered the most prominent English-speaking literary figure of the first half of the 20th century, is often credited with redefining the modern novel. Joyce experimented with the form and revolutionized it through his first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916, and with his masterpiece, Ulysses, 1922. In which he developed the techniques of interior monologue and stream of conscious narrative. Writer William Faulkner, 1897 to 1962, was the American counterpart to Joyce's experimentation with the form of the novel. The author of The Sound and the Fury, 1929, Light in August, 1932, and Absalom, Absalom. 1936, among others, Faulkner, in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949, stated that the fundamental theme of his fiction is the human heart in conflict with itself. This he explored by employing a variety of narrative techniques, which, like Joyce's, departed radically from traditional methods.
Who was Dame Margot Fonteyn?
Fonteyn, 1919 to 1991, has been called an international ambassador of dance. The British-trained ballerina achieved worldwide fame and recognition during more than 34 years with the Royal Ballet, expanding the company's female repertoire and becoming the model for the modern ballerina. In 1962, at the age of 43, Fonteyn formed a dance partnership with Soviet defector Rudolf Nureyev. 1938 to 1993, challenging traditional assumptions about the ability of mature dancers to continue vigorous performance careers. In her later years, she continued to be active in the world of dance, helping set up dance scholarships, fostering international artistic relations, and encouraging the growth of dance institutions around the world.
What was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre?
It was a mass murder in 1572, which began on August 24, the Roman Catholic feast day of St. Bartholomew. The slaughter, which eventually claimed an estimated 70,000 lives, was part of decades of civil wars between Roman Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, in France. The Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517, and it spread through Europe over the following decades. By the 1560s, as many as one-third of the French people were Protestants. The growth of a Reformed Christian faith threatened the Roman Catholic Church and eroded its power, both religious and political. In 1560, Charles IX, 1550 to 1574, a Roman Catholic, rose to power in France. But since he was just 10 years old at the time, the country was ruled by a regent, his mother, Catherine de' Medicis, 1519 to 1589. Catherine was a descendant of the powerful Medici family of Florence and, as the wife of King Henry II, 1519 to 1559, the Queen of France. Even after Charles IX reached the age of majority, she continued to dominate him. By 1572, Catherine feared the growing influence that another person, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, 1519 to 1572, had on her son, the king. Coligny was a leader of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and, in fact, he did hold sway over Charles IX. To remove this threat, Catherine authorized a plot by Roman Catholic nobles to assassinate Coligny. On August 18, Catherine's daughter, Margaret of Valois, 1553–1615. Was married to Henry of Navarre, 1553–1610, a Huguenot. The royal event brought many Huguenot nobles to Paris. On August 22, an attempt was made on Coligny's life, but he survived. Catherine feared that an investigation into the attack on Coligny would reveal her role in it. She therefore gave approval to a wider plan to exterminate Huguenots. And she convinced her son, Charles IX, to order it. According to French statesman and historian Jacques-Auguste de Thou, 1553–1617. The order stated that it was the will of the king that, according to God's will, they should take vengeance on the band of rebels the Huguenots while they had the beasts in the toils. The massacre began with the toll of a palace bell on August 24. Those who carried out the killings on the Huguenot leaders identified themselves with white armbands and a white cross on their hats. Coligny was among the first victims, but Protestants throughout Paris were targeted. As citizens became involved in the mayhem, several thousand perished in the city, causing the waters of the river Seine to run red. Throughout the provinces over the next several weeks, thousands more died, the victims of mob attacks on Protestants. News of the attacks was greeted with approval by Roman Catholic leaders. Protestants throughout Europe were horrified. The plot carried out on St. Bartholomew's Day had launched a mass extermination, fueling the hatred between Catholics and Protestants.
What did the United States gain from the Mexican War?
The Mexican War, 1846–48, was officially ended when the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on March 10, 1848. By the treaty, Mexico relinquished roughly half its territory, New Mexico and California, to the United States. Mexico also recognized the Rio Grande as its border with Texas. Mexico received payments in the millions from the United States, which also assumed the payment of claims of its citizens. 5 years later, under the terms of the Gadsden Purchase, the United States purchased a small portion of land from Mexico for another $10 million, which was widely regarded as further compensation for the land lost in the war. The territory the United States gained was in present-day Arizona and New Mexico, south of the Gila River.
When was the first newspaper published?
Newspapers, publications that are issued regularly, usually daily or weekly, to notify readers of current events, had their first recorded appearance about 59 B.C., when Romans posted a daily handwritten news report in public places. The report was called the Acta Diurna, or Daily Events. In about AD 700, the Chinese developed the world's first printed newspaper, called the Daibao, it was printed from carved wooden blocks. The invention of the movable type printing press, c. 1450, spurred the development of the newspaper as we know it. In Germany, regularly published newspapers began being circulated in the early 1600s. Newspapers proliferated in the 1800s after the development of a machine that allowed paper to be produced in sheets of any size.
What was the Doomsday Book?
It is an important document surviving from the reign of England's William I, c. 1028–1087, a Norman who had conquered England in 1066 to become king. He ordered the survey so that he could have a complete record of England's lands, property owners, and resources. He used this information to his advantage, even taking possession of some properties thereafter. The census is considered an excellent record of Europe's Middle Ages, 500–1350.
What happened on Apollo 13?
On April 13, 1970, a damaged coil caused an explosion in one of the oxygen tanks on the moon-bound U.S. spacecraft, leaving astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes in a disastrous situation. The explosion damaged the fuel cells as well as the craft's heat shield, which was needed to protect the vessel upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. While the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had experienced a previous disaster in 1967, when 3 astronauts died in a fire on the launch pad. Mission Control had not faced anything like this before, and no Americans had ever been lost in space. After hearing a loud bang and seeing an oxygen tank empty, the Apollo 13 astronauts reported to Mission Control at the Johnson Space Center, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem." The ensuing real-life drama proved that to be an understatement. The crew moved into the craft's tiny lunar module, designed to keep 2 men alive for just 2 days. With the astronauts 4 days from home, NASA engineers had their work cut out for them. Among other measures, the temperature in the module was lowered to 38 degrees Fahrenheit to conserve oxygen and electricity. The world was waiting and watching as the module splashed down in the South Pacific, just barely ahead of the failure of the oxygen. All 3 astronauts survived the disaster, which came to be known as the successful failure. Apollo 13 never reached its destination but, despite the odds, made it back to Earth safely.
What was the Chiapas Uprising?
Also called the Zapatista Uprising. It was a January 1994 revolt staged by Mayan rebels in Chiapas, Mexico's southernmost state. On New Year's Day, members of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, AZLN, launched a coordinated attack on 4 municipal capitals and a Mexican army headquarters in the remote region. With the cry of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, the armed insurgents invoked the name and spirit of Emiliano Zapata. 1879 to 1919, Mexico's early 20th century revolutionary leader. The EZLN, or Zapatistas, destroyed government offices, burned land deeds, and freed prisoners. At least 135 people died in the rebellion. On January 12, after 11 days of heavy fighting, a ceasefire was called. The next month peace talks began between EZLN representatives and the Mexican government. Negotiations between the two sides proved to be a frustrating and lengthy process. Seeking democracy, liberty, and justice for all Mexicans. The EZLN called for government reforms, including local autonomy, as well as land redistribution and other measures to aid the region's impoverished indigenous population. In February 1996, the two sides signed the San Andrés Accords and agreed to more talks. But in August of that year, the dialogue stalled. The EZLN said it would not return to the negotiating table until the government implemented the San Andrés Accords. Meanwhile, pro-government paramilitary groups with ties to Mexico's ruling PRI party, Institutional Revolutionary Party, made their presence known in Chiapas. There were violent episodes, the most horrific of which occurred on December 23, 1997, when the pro-government paramilitary group Paz y Justicia, Peace and Justice, brutally attacked a group of unarmed indigenous people in the village of Octeal. A total of 45 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered, and 25 more were injured. The turbulence in Chiapas is fueled by deep-seated anti-government feelings among the indigenous, Mayan, population. Despite the fact that it is rich in natural resources, including coffee, corn, timber, and oil, it is one of the poorest regions of Latin America. The wealth of Chiapas rests in the hands of a few. In 1990, half of the population in the state was malnourished, 42% had no access to clean water, 33% was without electricity, and 62% did not have a grade school education. It was no coincidence that the 1994 uprising took place the same day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect, according to one Zapatista leader. NAFTA was the death sentence for Mexico's poor farmers, who would now have to compete with farmers north of the border. In 2005, more than 10 years after the Zapatistas burst onto the scene, the situation in Chiapas remained unresolved.